This is Prep Test 156, Section 3, Passage number 1. This is a law passage about the tension between two things we want from the legal system. The difficulty level, I would say, is medium, and this is not a hard read, but the author hides a strong opinion inside what looks like a balanced discussion, and that's where students get burned. This is a passage where the author makes an argument. The author is setting up two competing demands we place on the law, then picks a winner. The main point here is that formalism can't deliver real justice in an unequal society, so we should abandon it altogether. Now, let me walk you through how this moves. The passage opens by naming the problem. We want two things from the law, and they pull in opposite directions. That is the whole engine of this passage. Everything after this is the author working through which one wins. The first demand is formalism. The author lays out what that means. A system built on rules, applied the same way to everyone, blind to who you are or what you own. And notice how good this sounds. It's rational, it's coherent, it's consistent. The passage makes formalism feel like the obviously right answer. And I want you to hold on to that feeling because the author is going to use it against you. Because then comes on the other hand, and that phrase is your signal. The passage pivots to the second demand, what the author calls substantive justice. That means outcomes that are actually fair, not just processes that checked all the boxes. And here's what matters. The author doesn't just describe this demand, they start arguing for it, because look at the language here. A legal system that only follows rules speaks little to the substance of justice. That is not a neutral observation. That's the author telling you formalism alone isn't enough. Now, here's a detail most students blow right past. The author uses the word imperative twice in this passage. Once for formalism, once for substantive justice. And both demands get called essential. Both get the same weight at first. And that setup is deliberate, because by the end, the author is going to say which one of them has to go. And when you realize both were called imperative, the conclusion hits that much harder. Now, I want you to slow down right around where they say, "it seems then," because that phrase marks a key turn. Everything before it was set up. Everything after it is the verdict. The author says the tension between formalism and substantive justice is irreconcilable. Now, that word sounds like the author is throwing up their hands, like they're saying there's no answer. But I want you to keep reading here and not to get stuck here, because the key move is the author lays down a condition. Formalism can only work if society is already equal. And since we don't have that equality, formalism won't just fail to deliver justice, it will perpetuate injustice. And that word perpetuate matters. It means formalism actively makes things worse. Not neutral or harmless, but actually harmful. So the author's conclusion is clear. Abandon formalism and let the law adapt to how the world actually works. The last line calls the whole project of reconciling these two demands misguided, and that's their verdict. So here's the stance, plain and simple. The author thinks formalism sounds good on paper, but fails in practice because society is not equal. Substantive justice is what matters, and if formalism gets in the way, cut it loose. So the main trap is reading this passage as balanced, and that's an easy trap to fall into. The author spends real time building up formalism. They describe it carefully and fairly, so students walk away thinking the author respects both sides equally. But balance in the description does not mean balance in the conclusion. The author lands hard against formalism. And so if you pick an answer that says the author is weighing two valid approaches, you're wrong. And this will show up on main point questions where the trap answer will describe the tension without the resolution. It'll show up on attitude questions, for example, where the trap answer will say the author is undecided or even-handed. And it could show up in function questions about the opening section. The formalism description sets up to set up the rejection, not to endorse it. So before you hit the questions, I want you to check yourself on these. First, what specific condition does the author say would need to exist for formalism to work? Second, why does the author spend so much time making formalism sound appealing if they're going to reject it? And third, what is the difference between procedural justice and substantive justice as the author uses those terms. For pacing, you're going to want to read the opening description of formalism at normal speed. And then when you hit the phrase "on the other hand," that's when you slow down, because that's where the author's opinion starts coming through. And then read the final section starting with the phrase "it seems then" very carefully, because the conclusion is stronger than most students expect from a passage that starts off so even-handedly. And of course, if you have any questions about these, feel free to drop them in the comments. This is a live taping of me running through LSAT Reading Comp passage explanations. This is my project to work through every single LSAT Reading Comp passage ever, live on YouTube, TikTok, Instagram, LinkedIn, Facebook, wherever you're watching this. I'm taking requests, by the way. If there are particular passages you want me to prioritize, just drop them in the chat and I'll get to them sooner rather than later. But in the meantime, I will keep going on to the next passage. This is PrepTest 156, Section 3, passage number 2. This is a comparative passage. The topic is whether paranormal phenomena can exist outside the reach of science. The difficulty level here is medium. What makes this one tricky is that passage B sounds like it wins the argument, but the test doesn't care who wins. It cares whether you can actually see what each author is doing. Now, both passages ask the same question. Can science rule out the paranormal? Passage A says no, passage B says yes. But you don't want to treat this as two equal sides of a debate, because these passages are built differently, and that difference is what the questions are going to target. Passage A is Freeman Dyson, a physicist, building a case from the ground up. He opens by drawing a spectrum. On one end, you've got reductionists, people who think science explains everything. On the other hand, you've got traditionalists, people who think science is one source of knowledge among many. And Dyson places himself near the traditional end, and that one move tells you everything about where the passage is headed, so don't skim past it. Now watch the logic chain he builds. Scientific experiments on the paranormal have failed. Skeptics say this means the paranormal isn't real. And Dyson says, not so fast. Paranormal events only seem to happen under stress and strong emotion. And stress and strong emotion are exactly what controlled experiments eliminate. So the experiments weren't proving the paranormal doesn't exist. They were just proving science can't catch it. And of course, you don't have to agree with that. But you do need to follow each step because the questions will test whether you can. Then Dyson plays his biggest card. He brings in complementarity. And that is a term from quantum physics. It means two descriptions of something can both be true, but you can't observe them at the same time. His example is light. Light acts like a wave in one experiment and like particles in another. You never see both at once. Dyson is saying the paranormal works the same way. It's real, but it disappears the moment you set up conditions to measure it. And this is the most important move in either passage, so you want to remember this. Then passage B is pretty short, so you want to read it fast. The author here has one goal: to demolish what Dyson just said. There is no independent argument here, it's purely rebuttal. And it hits three targets. First, anecdotes aren't science. Second, controlled experiments have already given a clear answer. The paranormal is not real. The author calls psychic power a chimera, meaning an illusion, something that was never there. And third, complementarity doesn't apply. And the author's reasoning here is blunt. Either people can read minds or they can't. There is no both at once situation here. So here's what you gotta see. Passage A builds a chain where each claim supports the next, and passage B fires back with assertions. These are strong, confident assertions, but it doesn't build its own structure the way passage A does. And that's not the test telling you passage A that Dyson is right. It's the test giving you two passages that work in structurally different ways. You've got to track that difference. Now, the key move is complementarity. Dyson borrows a respected physics concept to shield his argument from the obvious objection, and passage B rejects it in two sentences. The hardest questions will live right there in the gap between how Dyson uses complementarity and why passage B says it doesn't fit. The main dynamic is direct disagreement. These authors are not talking past each other. Passage B takes Dyson's claims one by one and says no. Anecdotes, not evidence. Complementarity doesn't apply. Limits of science, there are none here. For author's stance, Dyson thinks paranormal phenomena might be real, but fall outside what science can access. He is not anti-science, he's saying science has a boundary. Students read him as rejecting science, but he's not. He is a physicist arguing that science doesn't cover everything, and that distinction matters. The author of Passage B thinks Dyson is wrong, full stop. Science tested the paranormal failed, and no amount of philosophy changes the result. The trap here is letting Passage B's tone do your thinking for you. It sounds more decisive, uses words like ridiculous, non-equivocal, but confidence is not the same as having a developed argument. If you assume Passage B is stronger just because it sounds stronger, you're going to misread the relationship between the two. Now, before you hit the questions, I want you to make sure you can answer these three things. First, what does complementarity mean in Dyson's argument, and why does he think it applies? Second, why does the author of Passage B say it doesn't apply? And third, what job is the anecdotal evidence doing in Passage A? Is it Dyson's main proof, or is it supporting something else in the chain? I see we have Tony commenting, I just passed the bar. Congrats, Tony, that is awesome. You rocked it. Happy for you there. I see Kate's requesting PrepTest 102 to 110 for reading comp explanations. Okay, so I'll move those up a little bit in the priority list if others feel the same way. I see IG's asking if I offer a prep course. Yes, I do. I'm also offering free LSAT tutoring for everybody watching this now or later. You can book that free tutoring lesson with me personally at unpluggedprep.com/start. The link is below the video on YouTube, pinned in the chat on YouTube, in my bio on TikTok and IG as well. And I see 2385's asking about the reading comp maybe not including comparative passages. Yes, that is a recent change starting with the January LSAT this year. You may or may not get comparatives without prior notice. LSAT is throwing those curveballs. Now, this is PrepTest 156, Section 3, Passage 3. This is a humanities passage about the origins of bebop jazz. The difficulty level is medium, and the reading's pretty smooth. The trap here is structural in nature. The author spends most of the passage building up a story that they are about to demolish. And if you don't catch where the demolition starts, you're going to walk out thinking the author believes the opposite of what they actually believe. This is a setup and reject passage. The author lays out the standard history of bebop, then says it's bad history. The most important in this passage is near the end. You're going to hit the line where the author calls the standard view a poor basis for historical inquiry, and that is the hinge. Everything before it is someone else's argument, and everything after it is the author's argument. So you want to slow way down when you get there. Now, paragraph 1 is pretty long, and it's doing one job. It's presenting the conventional story. Now, here is that story in plain terms. Swing jazz went stale by the early 1940s. The music industry kept it alive because it made money. Then bebop came along and smashed through that wall. That is the standard account, not the author's account. Now, you want to read this paragraph at a pretty steady pace, but don't get invested emotionally. Your only job here is to tag it. This is the view being set up for takedown. The author gives you clues. You want to watch out for the quotation marks like threadbare, billion-dollar rut, harmonic and melodic blind alley. Those are not the author's words. They're borrowed from other jazz writers. And the scare quotes are the author holding those ideas at arm's length. And there's also a pretty sneaky move buried in this paragraph also. The author compares the bebop story to the crisis theory used in classical musical history. And that sounds academic, but here's what it means in practice. The same kind of story gets told about early 20th century classical composers. Tonality was supposedly exhausted, so modernism had to explode out of it. The author is saying the bebop story is a copy of that template, and that is not a compliment. It's the author saying this narrative is borrowed, not earned. And then the passage introduces the word teleology, and that just means a story where everything points toward one inevitable ending. The standard account treats jazz like it was always heading toward bebop. Early jazz to swing to bebop. Each step strips away more of the popular commercial side. Dance goes, pop songs go, entertainment goes, until jazz finally becomes pure art. And the author thinks that story is too clean to be true. And then you've got the turn. The author says this anti-commercial reading may suit the needs of contemporary jazz discourse. And you want to stop on that phrase. May suit the needs is a devastating phrase. It means the story is useful, but not accurate. People tell it because it serves a purpose, not because it happened that way. And then the author gives you their real position, and it is specific. The bebop musicians didn't see the market as a prison. They saw it as the system that made music a profession. Commerce was not the enemy, it was the infrastructure. Parker, Gillespie, and Monk all created something genuinely new. But they weren't running from the commercial world. They were trying to find a better deal within it, with more autonomy and more recognition under the same system. And that distinction is everything. Escaping commerce versus renegotiating your relationship with commerce. Those are two completely different stories. The standard account says the first one, but the author says the second one. Now, the key move is that gap. The LSAT will build its hardest questions around whether you can tell the difference between bebop rejected commerce and bebop sought better terms within commerce. And the passage runs on a single structural move. A long, persuasive sounding setup that gets pulled out from under you. The standard story takes up roughly 2/3 of the passage and sounds confident and sounds reasonable, and the author thinks it's wrong, and the ratio of devoting more time to the standard story is actually a trap. Now, the author's stance here is direct. The anti-commercial reading of bebop is romantic myth dressed up as history. It ignores the fact that commercial relationships are baked into all music making. The main trap is buying the crisis theory during your read and then treating it as if it's the author's view. If that happens, you're going to miss the main point question. You'll also miss the author's attitude towards commercialism. The author doesn't think commercialism corrupted jazz. The author thinks commercialism enabled it. Now, before you hit the questions, you want to make sure you're solid on 3 things. First, why does the author keep putting other writers' phrases in quotation marks? Second, what is the author actually saying when they compare the bebop story to the crisis theory in classical music? And third, can you explain in your own words the difference between escaping the market and finding a new point of engagement with it? And that third one's where you're going to find your points. Now, this is PrepTest 156, Section 3, Passage 4. It is about a chemist who found a biodegradable replacement for a widely used industrial chemical. And this reads like a standard straightforward science story, but it's not. There is an opinion buried in this passage that most students miss entirely, which makes this medium difficulty. Now, this is a science passage, but it's not just explaining a discovery, it is actually building a case. The author wants you to believe the industry made a mistake when it walked away from polyaspartate. Now, the most important paragraph here is the third one. That's where everything turns, so we're going to spend the most time here. Paragraph 1 is the origin story. Koskin reads about oyster shells, has an insight, and connects it to an industrial problem. Now, here's what you need to lock in. Oysters produce polyaspartate. It does the same job as polyacrylates. It stops mineral scale buildup on equipment. But polyaspartate is biodegradable because its backbone is made of peptides, meaning chains of amino acids. Polyacrylates aren't biodegradable. Their backbone is hydrocarbon-based. And that single difference drives everything that follows. Now, don't get lost in oyster biology, it's just the spark. You want to read this at normal speed, but make sure you walk away with one thing. Same job, different backbone. One breaks down and one doesn't. Now, paragraph 2 is a misdirect. You're reading about polyaspartate's potential, and suddenly the passage stops talking about it completely. The whole paragraph is about polyacrylates, how useful they are, how cheap they are, how they show up in detergents, diapers, everywhere. 500 million pounds a year in detergents alone. 2 billion pounds a year in diapers. The author is stacking those numbers on purpose. You are supposed to feel the scale and the weight of the problem before you see the word landfills. The last sentence, these vast quantities are being discarded in landfills, is the whole reason this paragraph exists. Everything before it is built up So you want to skim the middle and slow down at the end. Now, paragraph 3 is where skimming destroys you. 3 things happen fast, and you've got to catch all of them. First is the good news. Koskin starts a company. Big chemical firms get interested. Everyone agrees polyaspartate is the most suitable replacement. Then second, you've got bad news. It costs 4 to 5 times more. The industry drops it. Now, you want to watch the word unfortunately right before the price reveal. That is not a neutral word. That's the author telling you this was a loss. Then third, you've got the comeback. Koskin's company stays in the fight. They skip the mainstream market and go after specialty niches like offshore oil equipment and farming, and it works. Polyaspartate shows unparalleled success in those areas. Then look at the very last line. The author says Koskin may yet help enliven the environmental chemistry sector. That phrase, may yet, is careful. It's hopeful, but not certain. The author isn't saying Koskin won. The author is saying Koskin might still change the game. Now, the key move here is the gap between what the industry decided and what actually happened. The big players looked at the price tag and they quit. So Koskin found another path. The test will ask you to see that the author thinks the quitting was premature. Now, here is the main trap. The passage feels like a neutral science explainer, but it's not. The author has a clean lean in favor of Koskin's side. Unfortunately, the phrase unfortunately tells you the author thinks the industry's decision was a bad call. The phrase may yet help enliven tells you the author is still rooting for this outcome. If you read this as a flat news report, you're going to pick wrong. You'll miss on the main point, you'll miss on the author's attitude. You're going to grab the answers that say objectively describes a chemical process instead of one that says advocates for an overlooked alternative. The advocates is closer to being correct. Now, before you hit the questions, you want to check yourself on 3 things. First, why does the author spend an entire paragraph on polyacrylates when the passage is really about polyaspartate? Second, whose side is the word unfortunately on? And third, why does the passage end on Koskin's niche instead of the industry shelving the technology? So why are they focusing on Koskin winning versus the industry shelving? What's the purpose of that? So that's PrepTest 156. Now we're going to go on to PrepTest 123, Section 4, Paragraph 1. Passage 1. This is PrepTest 123, Section 4, Passage 1. The divide between poetry and fiction in U.S. writing programs and one writer who refuses to pick a side. The difficulty level here is pretty low. It's pretty easy. The author's opinion's on the surface the entire time. But there is one distinction on the back end that the test will definitely build questions around, and most students blow right past it. Now, this is a humanities passage. The author thinks the wall between poetry and fiction is a cultural hang-up, not a real literary boundary. And Rita Dove's work is the proof. That is your main point. You want to hold on to it. Now, the most important section is the back half, lines 38 to 55 if you're using the paper version of the test. Everything before it is setup. Everything in it is what the test cares about. If you gave the second half the same attention as the rest, go back and read it again, give it some more time. Now, paragraph 1 lays out the status quo. Poetry and fiction live in separate boxes. Writing programs train you in one or the other. The conventional wisdom says poetry handles inner states and feelings. Fiction says character and plot are the focus. And the author, of course, grants the distinction, says, yeah, they're different genres, but then look at the last sentence. It's a question. Why has this distinction turned into segregation? That's not a neutral question. That's the author saying this has gone too far. And you're going to know their position before you even leave paragraph 1. So read at normal speed. Don't get bogged down in the description of what each genre supposedly does. That is just context. Then paragraph 2 explains the cause. U.S. culture does not trust generalists. If you're good at more thing, people assume you're a dilettante, meaning you're a dabbler, you're not serious. Jack of all trades, master of none sort of thing. And that is the cultural attitude driving this split. But then the author turns a corner. They say this bias is shrinking. Recent writers are getting respected in both genres. And so this paragraph does 2 jobs. It diagnoses the problem, then it tells you the problem is already on its way out. So move through this fast. The cultural explanation here is just the background, it's not the argument. Paragraph 3 introduces Rita Dove. She is the proof that the trend is real. She's acclaimed in both poetry and fiction and finds the whole separation bizarre. She grew up loving both genres, studying in Germany, where writers cross genre lines constantly. And that detail about Germany is not decoration, it's there to show you that the US approach is a cultural choice, not some natural law of literature, saying other countries don't do this. But you're still in just the setup territory here. You're learning what Dove thinks. You haven't seen her work yet. So again, move through this at normal speed, don't camp out. But now you want to slow way down because this is the pivot coming up. The author stops telling you what Dove believes and starts showing you what her writing actually does. And this is where most students lose the thread. The author says each genre shares in the nature of the other. Then you get a very specific breakdown of how Dove's poetry works. The language here is lyrical, it hits you emotionally, doesn't force a timeline. But buried inside that lyric language, she's laying down narrative details, like plot elements, character beats, and they build up until the poem is basically functioning as fiction. And then the author flips it. Dove's fiction uses poetic rhythms and, quote, elliptical expression, meaning compressed, clipped, leaving gaps the way poetry does. So her prose starts looking and reading like poetry. And so here's what you've got to lock in. Dove isn't just someone who writes poems and also writes stories. She creates something the passage calls lyric narrative. And that term is doing all the heavy lifting here. It means the genres aren't side by side in her work. They're fused and blended into the same piece. And that is a completely different claim than saying she's talented in two fields. So the key move here is the distinction between writing in both genres and fusing both genres within a single work. That is what the hardest questions will test. If you collapse those two ideas into one, you're going to pick wrong answers that sound close, but miss the point. Now, the author's stance here is fully committed. The poetry-fiction divide is cultural nonsense, and Dove's work proves genres can merge inside a single piece of writing. The main trap here is grabbing an answer that praises Dove for working in two genres, but leaves out the blending, and the answer is going to be there. It'll sound right, and it will describe something that's technically true about Dove, but not the author's actual point. It's more of a shallow version. So expect this to show up on the main point question and probably on the author's attitude question also. Now, before you get to the questions, you want to check yourself on three things. First, can you explain the difference between Dove writing in both genres versus fusing them together? Second, do you know why Germany shows up in this passage? And third, can you put lyric narrative in your own words without using any terms or vocabulary words from the passage itself? Hey, what's up, Leonardo? Welcome. All right, here we go on to the next one. This is PrepTest 123, Section 4, Passage 2. This is a comparative passage. Both passages here ask where music came from in human evolution, and they agree on more than you might think. But the real disagreement is narrower than it looks, and that's what makes this one a bit tricky, more like a medium difficulty passage set. Now, both passages here are science-based. Passage A says music evolved as a byproduct of language. Passage B says music evolved on its own because it helped mothers bond with helpless infants. The main point across the two is two competing explanations for why humans make music built on the same evolutionary facts. Now, the most important section in this whole passage set is the end of passage A and the end of passage B. That's where each author plays their hand. Everything before those moments is just set up. And if you read the middles carefully and skim the endings, you're going to get the relationship backwards. Now, passage A starts with a genuine question. Did music and language start together or apart? Then it piles up similarities. Same brain systems, same features like rhythm and intonation, both can be silent or vocal. And that radio analogy there just means they share the same equipment. You don't want to slow down here. This is all just background. Your job is to just register, they're very similar, and then keep moving. And then passage A takes a turn. It says people are better at language than music. And most people, of course, don't compose music. And nearly everyone composes language. And from that one gap, the author jumps to a big conclusion. Natural selection was working on language, not music. Music just came along for the ride. And so that phrase, quote, on the coattails of language, that is the entire argument in 6 words. And you want to catch the phrase there, quote, little adaptive value of its own. The word own is doing the heavy lifting here. The author isn't saying music is useless. The claim is that music didn't evolve for its own reason, and that is a much more specific position than most students realize. Then passage B opens up with a Darwin quote. Darwin said music has no practical use. Then the author says, actually, you're wrong. That is the whole structure of the opening. Quote the big name, correct the big name. The author's position here is that music has enormous practical use for mothers and babies. Now, the middle of passage B is evidence. Mothers and infants do these face-to-face interactions full of musical elements incorporating pitch, rhythm, tempo, and volume, and researchers actually filmed this frame by frame. Now, you want to read this section at normal speed, but don't get buried in all the details. All of it supports just one claim: babies and mothers already make music together naturally. Then passage B lays out the evolutionary logic. So you want to skim proof this part. Brain size went up, walking upright, that's bipedality, narrowed the birth canal. And so babies came out earlier and more helpless. More helpless babies needed stronger maternal care. And those musical interactions built the emotional bonds that kept infants alive. And so music absolutely did have adaptive value. It solved a problem of survival. Now, the key move across both passages is one word: adaptive value. Passage A says music had little adaptive value of its own. Passage B says musical mother-infant bonding would have conferred considerable evolutionary advantage. That is a direct collision, and that is what the hardest questions will likely test. So how do these passages actually relate? Not the way most students think. The easy mistake is reading passage A as being anti-music and passage B as being pro-music. But passage A doesn't say music is worthless. It says music is real, neurologically grounded, and deeply connected to language. It just denies music has its own evolutionary purpose. Now, notice what passage B never does. It never mentions language, not once. It doesn't argue against the language-music connection. It completely ignores it. Then passage B builds a separate origin story from scratch. And so on relationship questions, don't say passage B attacks passage A's claims about language. That is not what happens. They're offering rival explanations, not having a direct argument. Now, there's one pattern here worth catching. Both authors use the same fact that brain size increased during hominid evolution, but they draw opposite conclusions from it. Passage A says bigger brains gave us language and music tagged along. Passage B says bigger brains plus narrower birth canals created helpless infants, and music solved that problem. They have the same starting point, but totally different destinations. Now, the main trap for this passage is exaggerating passage A's position. If you walk away thinking passage A says music doesn't matter, you're going to pick wrong answers on the attitude and relationship questions. Passage A's position is specific. Music matters, but it did not evolve independently. And that independently part is the entire game. Now, before you hit the questions, make sure you're solid on 3 things. First, why does passage B quote Darwin, and what does the author have to do with that quote right afterwards? Second, what specific evidence does each passage use to support its evolutionary claim? And third, what do these 2 passages actually disagree about regarding brain science, or are they only disagreeing about why music actually exists? This is PrepTest 123, Section 4, Passage 3. It's about copyright law and the World Wide Web. Specifically, whether linking to someone else's content counts as infringement. The difficulty of the reading is pretty low, but that is actually the danger here. The author's position is so obvious that students stop paying attention to how the argument actually works, and then the questions punish them for it. This is a law passage making a one-sided argument. The author thinks strengthening copyright law to go after web linking is a mistake, and that is the main point, and nothing here pushes back on it. The author builds the actual case on one analogy. And if you lock onto that analogy, the questions are pretty easy, but if you glaze over it, you're going to be guessing. The opening lines here set up a fight between 2 camps. intellectual property owners want stronger copyright protection. That's it. In contrast, web users want the web to stay open. Now, this is all just background. Read it at a pretty normal speed. But then, something makes the web legally tricky. In print, you've got to cite a source and the reader has to go track it down. But on the web, you're clicking, you're there. And that instant access is what makes people nervous about copyright. And the author frames the legal question directly. If B links to A's document, is B committing infringement? This section matters, but they're just asking the question, not answering it, so you want to keep moving. But then the author answers that question with an analogy about a telephone answering machine. When A puts a document on the web, it's like recording a message outgoing for anyone who calls. So person A is choosing to make it available. When person B creates a link, that's like giving out A's phone number. Person B is not copying the message, B is just telling people where to find it. Now watch out for the word controls here because it's doing all the heavy lifting. The author's whole argument turns on one claim. A is the one who controls access because A put the document out there. B just pointed to it. So linking is not the same as distributing. And that distinction is the core of the entire passage. Then comes the conclusion in line 42 later in the passage. Creating a link is not the same as making or distributing a copy. Everything before this sentence builds up to it, everything after it defends it. Then the final section does two things. First, the author says technical solutions already exist. Person A can put a password on the page, the same way you get an unlisted phone number. And second, those technical fixes hurt the web's openness a little bit, but changing copyright law would hurt it a lot more. So don't change the law. That's where the passage ultimately lands. Now, the author's stance here is pretty straightforward. Linking is not infringement, and tightening copyright law would damage the web as a public forum. Now, here is where students go wrong. The opening presents the intellectual property owner's concern, and it sounds pretty reasonable, and students give that side more weight than the author does. But look at the passage again. After the setup, every single line argues against the property owner's position. There is no counter-argument, there's no concession. If you treat this like a balanced discussion between two legitimate sides, you're going to pick the wrong answer on main point and author's attitude questions. Then before you get to the questions, make sure you know three things. First, who controls the distribution of a document on the web according to the author? Second, what exactly is the telephone analogy supposed to prove? And third, why does the author say technical solutions are better than legal ones? Now, the key move you want to know here is that one analogy does all the work. Web links equal phone numbers, not copies. The hardest questions in this set will test whether you know what that analogy proves, and whether you caught that the author treats it as the end of the argument, not the beginning of the debate. Final passage. This is PrepTest 123, Section 4, Passage 4. It's about using fossilized pollen to study how Ireland's landscape changed over time. I'd rate this one a medium difficulty because the content's pretty simple. The trap here is structural. The passage gives you 3 examples, and students treat them like they're all doing the same thing, but they're not. 2 of them prove the method works, 1 proves it does not work. And if you miss that shift, you're going to be in trouble. Now, this one is a science passage. The main point is that pollen analysis is a useful tool for filling holes in Ireland's historical record, but it has real limits. The most important moment in this passage is the transition into the final section, where the author goes from cheerleading pollen science to admitting what it cannot do. And that's where the hardest questions will come from. Paragraph 1 here is pure setup. Historians have used documents to study Ireland's landscape, and those documents aren't great, they are fragmentary. Before the 17th century, there's almost nothing, and what does exist is skewed toward military and commercial interests. That is all you need from this paragraph. You want to move through it quickly. Its only job is to create a problem that pollen analysis can solve. Now the passage introduces pollen analysis. Pollen grains get trapped in sediments. Scientists can figure out what plants were growing and roughly when. Now pay attention to one phrase here, supplement or correct. Those 2 words map onto everything that follows. Sometimes pollen fills in blanks the documents left. That is supplementing. Sometimes pollen proves historians flat out wrong, and that is correcting. The passage gives you one example of each, and then a third example breaks the pattern entirely. First example, cereal pollen at Long Low in County Down, dating to around 400 AD. Historians believed these heavy clay soils were not tilled until the moldboard plow arrived in the 7th century. The pollen says otherwise. Grain was growing there 2 centuries before the plow, so the pollen corrected the record. Historians had a belief based on documents. The pollen proved it wrong, clean and simple. Second example, flax in County Down, and this one's a bit sneakier. Historians knew Down was a major linen region in the 18th century. They knew flax cultivation existed elsewhere in Ireland for centuries, so they guessed flax was probably grown in Down before the 18th century too. Reasonable guess, but the pollen says no. Flax pollen only appears in 18th century deposits. Now, here's what makes this different from the cereal example. The historians were not relying on a document. They were making an inference. The passage even tells you the documentary record tells little about flax in that area. So the pollen is not overturning a written record. It's overturning a logical assumption, and that is a different kind of correction. And if a question asks about the function of this example specifically, you've got to know that. Now the passage flips, so you want to slow down here a lot. The author says pollen analysis has limits, and this example is madder, a dye plant historically important in Ireland. Madder belongs to a plant family that includes wild weeds like goosegrass, and their pollen looks identical. So even if somebody was cultivating madder, you would never be able to prove it from pollen alone. This example does the opposite of the first two. Those showed the method succeeding, this one shows it failing. And a lot of students skim right past this one because it feels like just another illustration, but it is a reversal. Now the key move here is that shift from success to limitation. The LSAT will build its hardest questions around whether you understood that the author supports pollen analysis but refuses to oversell it. Now the author's stance here is genuinely positive. Pollen analysis has already caught historians making wrong assumptions, and it works, but the author is also careful. The word limits is in there for a reason. The madder example is a boundary marker. Now here is the trap most students fall into. They walk away thinking this passage is straightforward advertising for pollen science, so when they see a main point answer that says pollen analysis reliably reconstructs Ireland's vegetative history with no hedging and no qualifier, they pick it. But that answer would be wrong because the whole last section here exists to block it. Any correct main point answer has to include the limitation. Now, before you get to the questions, you want to make sure you're solid on 3 things. First, why does the author bring up the cereal example and the flax example separately instead of picking just one? Second, what is the difference between what those 2 examples prove? And third, why does the passage end on a failure case instead of a success story? So there you have it, folks. Those are the reading count passage explanations for today. I hope you found this helpful. If you're looking for support with your LSAT prep, I'm offering free LSAT tutoring for everybody watching this now or later. The link to book that free tutoring lesson with me is at unpluggedprep.com/start. The link is below the video on YouTube, pinned in the chat on YouTube, in my bio on TikTok and IG as well. I'll be back tomorrow for the regular live, tomorrow at 2 p.m. Eastern, 1 Central, 11 Pacific, here on YouTube, TikTok, Instagram, wherever you're watching this. And of course, I'll be continuing with the free reading comp explanations as well. In the meantime, I wish you all the best and take care. Thanks for joining.